my thinking about politics in the humanitarian condition, I'm looking here really at kind of small-scale, non-institutionalized forms of political life. So not primarily political parties, political movements, but the small-scale efforts that people make to make a change in the conditions of one's existence. Because I think that's important. When we talk about politics, a lot of times we do focus on large-scale organized movements. Certainly, the current moment in the Middle East is one in which big politics is kind of back on the table. But I think that we also need to really give attention to this kind of daily work of trying to change things, of trying to make politics, and that's what I'm looking at here. And I focus on two features of political expression: rights claims and existential conditions. There are several registers to the rights claims that have emerged in the humanitarian domain. In contexts where there's limited opportunity to push states for political rights, right? In Jordan, it's very difficult to make a direct political claim. Palestinian refugees have used the language of humanitarian rights to try to make arguments for changes in their status. So in some ways, it's a way of sort of bypassing some of the constraints that are on people. And at the same time, the humanitarian apparatus itself, and especially UNRWA, becomes a site for the articulation of national political demands. And we were already talking about that, and I think that's evident to everybody. Now, in regards to existential questions, I mean, this brings us to, in some ways, the notion of sumud, right? And the importance of being Palestinian as itself a political act, right? That both inside Palestine and for refugee communities outside. And this doesn't just happen, right? There is a calculus of life, the same way that humanitarian organizations are making arguments about and decisions about values of life. Within a Palestinian existential sort of politics, there are claims made about the values of certain ways of living, right? Certain ways of being Palestinian that are seen to have greater value for Palestinian national community. And this itself becomes a site of struggle. And I think that the humanitarian apparatus is a key forum in which these kinds of contests occur, right? It's one of the sort of stages for a discussion, a contestation about community. Now, I'll run sort of briefly through some of the trajectory of humanitarian assistance from 48. And again, we can talk more later when we're talking about the different concept of humanitarianism, some of the transformations that have occurred. In the immediate aftermath of the Nakba, the UN commissioned private organizations to deliver UN assistance. And then, so the Quakers worked in Gaza, the Red Cross worked in Lebanon, so this was UN funded, but not UN delivered. But then as time went on and clearly a resolution was not on the horizon, the UN established UNRWA to manage humanitarian assistance across the Middle East. And even as the camps are the geographic center of this assistance regime, I think as we think about the history of humanitarianism and the experience of humanitarianism, I think we should remember that even no more than half of refugees ever lived in camps, right? So there's multiple kinds of refugee experiences, not just now, but even from the beginning. And obviously UNRWA assistance isn't limited only to people who live in camps, though practically being near installations can help. When UNRWA was first established, it provided a broad range of services to people, right? From rations to clothing, shelter, education. Over the years, the range of services has been reduced, right? And particularly in most places, most people don't receive rations, right? Except for those who qualify as special hardship cases. And UNRWA has never been the only organization providing assistance to Palestinians, though some places, like the West Bank, has a pretty, what we could say, dense humanitarian landscape, right? Lots of different organizations working here. Lebanon also has lots of different kinds of organizations. Jordan, much less. I'm going to focus primarily on UNRWA's work. Now, access to UNRWA services has been regulated by administrative procedures that have defined which people were eligible for registration on the refugee rolls. And these procedures are complicated and have changed a lot over the years. There's not, there's the initial basic definition, which I'm sure everybody is familiar with, right? But that definition has been transformed, in practice to make determinations about eligibility, right? Who is in need, who is inside the area of UNRWA operations. And I think it's important to remember also as we think about the definition of a Palestinian refugee that it's an operational rather than a legal one, right? It was developed precisely to identify who was eligible for UNRWA services, but doesn't account for all of the forms of loss that happened in 1948, right? So you could have lost land, but this is a frequent issue in Gaza where native Gazans lost their land but were not displaced, and so they're not counted in the accounting of loss within UNRWA. Right? So it's not a complete accounting for all sorts of reasons of Palestinian loss. So there were multiple categories of refugee and non-refugee from the earliest years after the Nakba. So that's never just a generic category. And again, we can talk more about that. The archival record, UNRWA's own record, is filled with often anguished accounts of people's passage from one category to another as they're moved from getting full rations to receiving less rations, because UNRWA's ways of accounting for need often didn't correspond to what people felt that they needed. Now, in addition to transformations of the ration regimes and changes in registration procedures, there's been all sorts of programmatic changes over the years, especially initial attempts to develop large-scale work projects that might have provided resettlement solutions, because when UNRWA was started, one of its tasks was to resettle, were quickly abandoned in the face of both political opposition and limited resources. And in recent years, you have much smaller scale, the emergence of much smaller scale kind of development projects. So I think the key point that I'd like you to take away from this, again, very brief discussion, is that humanitarianism over the long term is not the same humanitarianism all the time. Right? So what people are responding to in 1960 as they're living in humanitarianism is something different than you might be responding to in 2012. And it's not the same system. There's continuities, but there's very important changes. All right, so to look at some of these experiences, I want to turn now to the Gaza camp and to the situation of Gazans in Jordan. All right, so again, these are largely people that were refugees in 1948 to Gaza and then displaced to Jordan in 1967, and they're often called in Jordan ex-Gazans. And they're people in this category living throughout Jordan, right? There's a significant concentration in East Amman. There's a number of people who live in Aqaba. There are about 135,000 ex-Gazans registered with UNRWA. So again, that won't account for the whole population, but that gives you some sense. And the Jerash camp, the Gaza camp, is populated entirely by Gazans.
I just have a question.
Yes.
Displaced by who?
In 67?
Yeah.
By Israel. And I asked people, actually, because...
Not mentioned in the paper.
Yes. I asked people when, because obviously most people didn't leave Gaza in 67, right? But a number of people did. So I asked people, what made you leave? Israel did have a project. They hoped to encourage large numbers of people to leave Gaza in 67. And they paid for people to move. They brought buses and they set up travel agents, and they tried to do everything to make it easy for people to leave and encourage people to leave. But obviously most people didn't. It seems that most of the people who went to Jordan were people that were involved in resistance. So either in the PLA, the Palestinian Liberation Army, or Fedayeen in some other sense. So sometimes people were arrested and put in jail for a few years, and then when they were let out, told, what they were told, you can get out if you leave. Right? Or people left because they were avoiding being imprisoned, and then their families came with them. So that was one of the primary causes that people left. Now I've been working in Gaza camps since 2008, doing both life history, oral history interviews, visiting camp institutions, spending time in people's homes. Every camp, again, as Sandy mentioned in her discussion, is distinct materially, right? There's certain features that might distinguish a camp. The Gaza camp is about 3/4 of a kilometer, and one of the things that distinguishes it from other camps in Jordan is that it still has open sewers that run through the streets. There have been over the years various projects to try to change that. It hasn't happened yet, but I met someone in Lebanon who said that the Swiss are now going to fund a project, and so maybe those will be covered over. But definitely as a sort of visual material feature of the camp, the open sewers are a distinguishing feature. And the Gaza camp, like other camps in Jordan, and here is a camp in the humanitarian condition, right? Not in the midst of a humanitarian crisis at the moment, right? These are ongoing, chronic problems and situations that people are living in. Now, because the Gazans came from Egyptian-controlled territory rather than the Jordanian annexed West Bank, they do not have Jordanian citizenship. And this is crucial for impacting their experience of living in Jordan. They've had a tenuous legal status since they arrived. Most at this point have permanent residency and 2-year passports, but citizenship is largely unavailable. So as non-citizens, they don't have the national identity number, right, the Raqam Watani, which gives access to all sorts of services, health insurance, local tuition at public universities, government jobs, property rights. All of these things come along with a national number. And as we were discussing before, there is some difference in the population between those who are Lajain and those who are Nazahin. Most are Lajain, and most of the people who there are a large number of native Gazans who did live in the camp returned to Gaza after Oslo. So there's a smaller number of Nazahin. But of course that does make a difference, and there are people who don't have full access to UNRWA services because they're not registered as refugees.
Well, I mean that I wanted to say that they were refugees, then they became Nazahin because they were displaced during Al-Nakba. Then they displaced from Gaza to Jordan during Al-Nakba.
Right. Yes. So they've had both experiences.
And who returned from Gaza, from Jordan to Gaza? That's the first return, or they're just like no longer refugees?
They were never registered as refugees, right? So those there are those people both from the West Bank and from native Gazans who went to Jordan in '67 who hadn't been refugees before, right? Who weren't 48 refugees, were never registered with UNRWA as refugees, right?
Why?
Because according to UNRWA's bureaucratic procedures, a Palestine refugee is someone who was displaced in 1948 or their descendants, right? So here is another limit of that category. Now they are recognized, they are registered with the Jordanian government as Nazahin, as displaced, and UNRWA exceptionally, kind of on an emergency basis, provides assistance, some forms of assistance to those people who are Nazahin but not Lajain. But it's not as a matter of right in the same way that those who are registered as refugees are, right? This is another one of the distinctions within the sort of refugee definition of UNRWA, that there is a categorical distinction between 48 displacement and 67 displacement.
But then, if they're not according to the categories of the UNRWA, they are according to the UNHCR.
They don't fit. They probably should be. One could make that argument. They do not come under the UNHCR because of what is known as the Exclusion Clause. I don't know if this is an issue that has come up.
No.
Okay, so can I divert to a discussion of this? Right. So in the history of the establishment of the 1951 Refugee Convention, which is the basis for what was meant to be a universal, a global definition of a refugee. But it's important to note that in 1951, this was not global, right? The 1951 convention initially referred to things in Europe and to events that happened before its signing. So primarily you're talking about World War II, right? In 1967, this was then expanded. Those limitations were gotten rid of. So it applies to events at any time and populations anywhere. Palestinians, however, are specifically excluded from the convention definition. UNRWA had already been established by the time these negotiations about what the convention were going to be were going on at the same time as the Nakba and as the establishment of UNRWA. And there was a concern. There's lots of reasons for the exclusion, but there was partly a concern on the part of the host countries, the Arab governments, that if Palestinian refugees were treated as just kind of a generic refugee, that the specific situation would not be dealt with, right? That the particular kinds of claims and the politics of Palestinian displacement would be sort of lost in a general.
So for the good for the Palestinian refugees, they're not included.
Is part of the claim, right?